Okay then, brethren, we've mentioned the book of Daniel quite a number of times because it's quite important. The book of Daniel is sometimes referred to as the manual for the end times because so much of the book of Daniel relates literally to the end times, the last few years leading up to Jesus' return. Probably the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation would be seen to be the two key books in terms of giving us insight and notice and warning of what lies ahead. Now, in the book of Daniel, we've up till now sort of jumped around a little bit. We've looked at, Daniel 8 and then 7 and then 9 and 12 and back to 2 and so on and so forth. So because of its importance, although it might be good yet again, not the first time for us, to look at the entire book of Daniel from the beginning, obviously, to chapter 12 and see what we can learn from it. So we're going to go through the book of Daniel chapter by chapter, verse by verse, in particular, looking at its application to the end times. Now, as always, when we're looking at prophecy, I try my best to say, let's all understand the narrative, what the Bible actually says, its words, its pictures, its stories, its adventures, the narrative. When it comes to what those prophecies might mean, that's often a question of interpretation. Trying to understand what the symbol of the words might actually mean in today's day and age. And of course, when we're looking at prophecy, we often see through a glass darkly. We have to be careful with our interpretations. An interpretation isn't guaranteed to be as accurate as, say, the narrative itself would be. So I have my friend here, Nebuchadnezzar, who is a reminder to us when I'm straying into areas of interpretation. Can't avoid it because the scriptures give us a lot of information, but of course it's just left there for us to sort of interpret it. Now, hopefully we interpret it responsibly, not wild and wacky ideas, at least trying not to be wild and wacky, not building a doctrine or a prophetic understanding on one or two words. But certainly understand that at times we are looking at interpretation, and you're fallible and so am I, but we do our best, like I say, to be responsible in our interpretation. Now, the book of Daniel starts way back around about 600 AD, give or take a bit. At that time, BC, did I say? Yeah, BC, 600 BC, 2,500 years ago. And in those days, Babylon was just coming to power and was starting to move out from Babylon and to conquer the known world, at least in those regions. And that, of course, was something that had been prophesied just a few weeks ago. We looked at the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk, if you prefer, Habakkuk. And what did we see there? God said to Habakkuk, you won't believe what I'm going to do, Habakkuk, but I'm bringing the Chaldeans, that great, powerful, and hasty nation. I'm going to bring them against Jerusalem and Judah because I've had enough. After centuries of rebellion, I've had it, and I'm going to invade the country using the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. I'm going to cart the people off to captivity, going to destroy Judah, destroy Jerusalem. And Habakkuk was stunned by that message, but God said, no, write the vision down, make it plain so that people who see it, if they get any sense, will start running. And when we get to the book of Daniel, we're the days when the Chaldeans are coming, starting round about 600 or so BC. And of course, at this stage, the Chaldeans are coming, and they're led by this chicken's namesake, Mr. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He's the one who's going to, over a 20-year period, invade Judah. He does it essentially in 3 waves, starting round about 605 BC, and he concludes it round about 586 BC, 20 years later, when he destroys the walls of the city, destroys the Temple of Solomon, carts away the goods from inside it, destroys the walls, sets fire to the temple. That was over a 20-year period, starting in the days of Daniel. Now, it's curious in some ways, but God actually calls Nebuchadnezzar his servant. This Gentile king of a brutal nation, a warlike nation, is referred to by God as my servant, Nebuchadnezzar. Let's just see that out of curiosity in Jeremiah chapter 27. So Jeremiah 27, I'll read verses 1 through 8. It does make you think a little bit about how God works in the world through peoples and kings and nations. But Jeremiah 27, reading verses 1 through 8. In the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus says the Lord to me, make for yourselves bonds and yokes, like, handcuffs and things, and put them on your neck, and send them to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the Ammonites, the king of Tyre, and the king of Sidon, by the hand of the messengers who come to Jerusalem to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and command them to say to their masters, Thus says the Lord of hosts, Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, thus you shall say to your masters. This is the message they were to bring back as they wore these yokes over their shoulder, like oxen would wear, or people in captivity would wear. That's the picture. You could be taken captive in bondage. Say this to your masters in Moab and Ammon. So the nations all around, Judah were getting a message from God of what was about to happen. Verse 5. I, says God, have made the earth, the man and the beast that are on the ground by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it to whom it seemed proper to me. And now, says God, I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. So Jordan, Philistia, other countries all around this region, and of course Judah itself, God says, I've given them to my servant, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and the beasts of the field I have also given him to serve him. So all nations shall serve him and his son and his son's son, 3 generations, until the time of his land comes. Eventually Babylon will be judged, but not before God's used it as his tool to achieve God's purpose, as Habakkuk told everybody. And then many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. That's about 70 odd years in the future, right? So here's Nebuchadnezzar referred to as God's servant, my servant. And that's really quite interesting, as we'll see a little bit later. So Nebuchadnezzar arrives quite early on to take over Judah and Jerusalem. And then the first wave of attacks around about 605 BC or thereabouts, that's when Daniel is taken away with the captives, right? 20 years or so before it's finally destroyed. And so young Daniel is believed to be a teenager at this time when he's taken captive. Some reckon as early as perhaps his 14th year, maybe 16, 17, 18. Nobody can tell for sure, of course. But he's taken away captive to Babylon from his home in Judah, in Jerusalem. And it's considered that, as you'll see in a few moments, that probably Daniel had some pretty good parents, because Daniel's character, his conduct, his wisdom, his behavior is sort of exceptional, and you could at least attribute that in part to having pretty good parents, set him a good example, taught him well. Also, it's considered that Daniel was probably of royal lineage. That, again, is hinted at sort of shortly. So he was a pretty impressive guy, you've got to say. If you or I met Daniel at any point of his life, he certainly seems to be a man of some courage. Very faithful man. Great example of a man of God, just like you and I are great examples, right? I mean, Daniel, Ezekiel and Noah, all 3 of those were singled out by God. These 3 are among the top there are, Noah, Daniel and Ezekiel. I wonder, would you and I be in that? Anyway, let's turn to the book of Daniel, start off in chapter 1, obviously. So book of Daniel, chapter 1, let's read the verses 1 through 7 to start with. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, whom we just read about, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it for the first of at least 3 occasions. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, the temple, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, or New American Standard Bible says the chief of his officials. They may have been physical eunuchs, they may not, it's not entirely clear, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, and gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. So you can see there that these were some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, and among them was Daniel, so it's at least hinted at that Daniel had quite a good background, that good parents, but perhaps even some nobility, perhaps even part of the extended, royal family. Verse 5, and the king, Nebuchadnezzar, appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. It's interesting in some ways that, even in our day and age, 3 years is often the length of a college course, a university course. And so these captives, these young men who were captives, were to be trained, educated. And, at this time, Babylon was a great city in its day. It was a very wealthy city, a lot of military there, of course, the court, the lawgivers of the day. It was famous at the time for its knowledge of astronomy, mathematics. It mentions literature there. And this was the sort of the metropolitan place of the day. This was the Paris of those days. And to live there, to be employed there, to serve there, you were right at the very top. And so there's Daniel and other young Jewish boys. Not sure about girls, but certainly the Jewish boys were there. And so Daniel's he's in the center of the known world of this day, right? Obviously leading to things in the future, although no doubt Daniel has no idea at this time. So here he is at the home of science and mathematics and music and astronomy and military prowess. Verse 6. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel and 3 other guys, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, after Bel, the pagan god. To Hananiah, he's called Shadrach. To Mishael, the name Meshach. And to Azariah, the name Abednego, right? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shake the bed, make the bed, into bed you go, as known by children, and me as well for that matter. So let's read, so that's them, their journey round about 605-ish BC, and making their way into Babylon, where, strangely enough, they're right at the center of, let's say, world government, obviously. The book of Daniel and the prophecies generally are applied to the Middle East countries. There's no reference to the book of Daniel, I know of at least, to China and to the Incas and Mayas and Aztecs of Central and South America, and the Eskimos up in the Arctic, etc. Right? This is based around the region of the Middle East. Let's read verses 8 through 16. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank, the king that is, Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "Ooh, not sure about that, young man. I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink." And of course you would fear the king. The kings in those days didn't mess about. If they didn't like you, it was, right, head off or into the flaming fire. So the chief guy there, who's looking after these young nobles to train them up for court purposes and so on and so forth, he's not going to take a chance. He says, "I fear my lord the king, who's appointed you food and drink." Verse 10. "For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you'd endanger my head before the king, and my head's important to me." So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants." So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. So, Daniel is not keen to eat the food that's given to him. Potentially 2 reasons. One would be that a lot of it might be, sort of stewed lizard, rabbit pie, other unclean sort of foods. And a lot of it probably came via the pagan temples, and Daniel might have thought, a bit tainted sort of spiritually by where it comes from. So either way up, I don't want it. But he didn't just, throw his toys out the pram and roll around on the floor and spitting, right, and foaming in the mouth. He just says, please, so very polite, very courteous, "Please, may we avoid that and just eat this?" And the guy says, "Well, I don't want you to, lose your your appearance and become sickly looking because you're eating, just weeds out the garden." Daniel says, "No, I'll tell you what, let's just test it, shall we? Put it to the test for 10 days, and then your decision. If you think we look fine, we go with it. If you think we're losing weight and looking pretty miserable, then you call." So very polite, quite charming, very wise, also in a sense, quite courageous, because you are captive, right, in Babylon, and the king's not too far away, and the king doesn't like being, you refusing. So did I get that right? You, little teenage boy, are refusing the food that I eat and that I've sent to you? Well, that's the end of you, right? So it takes a bit of courage. And of course, you and I will have to face perhaps some difficult times in the future. We'll have to be as faithful as Daniel was. And I'm reminded of a sort of incident took place in my life back in my second Feast of Tabernacles in North Wales. I was staying in a small hotel in a little town in North Wales for the feast, and a buddy from the church also, he was staying in another room, same hotel. I booked both rooms for us. And a small hotel in those days, the meal was set. So the meal was between 6 o'clock in the evening and 7:30, and you sat down at a nice table and you get served with that day's meal. It wasn't like you had a menu and I'll have some of this and some of that and 2 of those and 3 of these. You just got the day's meal as part of the deal. And as we were heading that way, I wrote to them and said, 2 rooms please, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, I didn't use this language, but I said, we belong to a crackpot church that doesn't eat certain foods, so please don't serve us rabbit or pork or shellfish or nasty stuff like that. And put in a letter, very polite. We got there, checked in, and here comes the first meal that evening on the night to be much remembered evening. And Vic, the guy, and myself go down to the restaurant, sit down there. Out come the waiters, waitresses. 2 plates of roast pork and trimmings. Oh dear! I have to say, it looked quite nice actually. It's carrots, roast potatoes, cabbage, and some nice looking roast pork with gravy. It does look nice, but not right. So what do you do? bit embarrassing, isn't it? It's on the front of us. And, oh dear. So I got up anyway, went to the kitchens and sort of found the manageress in the kitchen, said, oh, excuse me, apologies. Unfortunately, I did write. Just sat down. Your lovely staff have brought out 2 plates with the roast pork, which is one of the things I mentioned we don't eat. Oh, she said, oh, terrible. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot all about that. Yes, I do remember everything you said. We have got something special for you. So go back out. Now they come with 2 separately prepared plates of roast beef with carrots and roast potatoes and gravy. Oh, lovely stuff. Which is fine. That's, I think, what you should do. But in the same restaurant was another church member, another young man who had made his own booking there, and he'd not advised them who he was or his eating preferences. So they put in front of him the day's normal meal: roast pork, gravy, etc. And he ate it. And of course, Vic and I thinking, he shouldn't be eating that, should he? He's only got to put his hand up and say, excuse me, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, I may not have advised you properly, but could I have something else? But, well, we reckon he chickened out. Either embarrassment, fear. But you look at Daniel's case, Daniel's in a lot trickier water than I was, with some nice old lady who was the manageress in the kitchen. You know, he's got a king there that'd be quite happy to take your head off, but he stood his ground politely, and it worked. So let's look at verses, where did we get to? It was verse
17 now.
14, I think it was. At the end of the 10 days, verse 15, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. I would have kept the wine, I think. Especially with nice red wine. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So these guys, you know, really grew in grace and knowledge, became quite powerful intellectually. You know, God blessed them in many, many ways, so they really stood out. Verses 18 through 21. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, that's after 3 years of training, education, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, the man himself. Then the king interviewed them. I guess he took this pretty important. These are young nobles who've been given 3 years of top-notch training in literature and astronomy and science and math and music and geography and military matters. And I'm going to select among this bunch of guys here the absolute brightest of them all. So a personal interview. He's going to check out if they've mastered their diversity and inclusive training, whether they know how to conduct themselves in a properly politically correct manner. You know, all the important things are so important to a man like Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. And thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus, who was actually Persian. And that was about 70 years later. So, Daniel was up there serving in the courts and the headquarters for 70 odd years. That's a long time. So if he had been sort of 15, when he was taken captive, and 3 years to be trained and educated, so he's going to be knocking on for 90-ish at the end of his days. Really, quite incredible. So you can tell already that Daniel's a little bit special. He's polite, he's courteous, but he stands his ground. There's no compromise, ever. With Daniel, he's polite to the king, he's polite to other people, but he fears God. So you got to say, well, whatever his mum and dad did in the 14, 15, 16 years that they had him as a child, it seems to have worked, because the man, or the boy, teenage boy, shows tremendous gifts of integrity and faithfulness. But moving on, question I guess is whether we'll be as faithful in the end times as somebody like Daniel turned out to be. Chapter 2, let's read verses 1 through 13. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, I think he'd overlapped with his father for a little bit, so the thinking here is the second year of his reign is the second year of his unique reign, just him only. Otherwise, the numbers don't quite add up. But anyway, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So obviously very disturbed. I mean, I occasionally have a dream that I find very disturbing, and sometimes, you sort of sit up, hope it'll go away, then you go back to sleep, and if it reappears, time to go to the bathroom or something and try and break those dreams. But typically I just snore my head off and wake up in the morning none the wiser. But Nebuchadnezzar has a special dream, stunning dream, and of course it turns out God's working with Nebuchadnezzar, who of course is his servant, insofar as Nebuchadnezzar will do what God wants doing in this region, taking care of Judah, for one thing, judging Judah, and God's servant to judge Judah is Nebuchadnezzar. So he's giving Nebuchadnezzar some real special insights here and in other chapters. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, verse 3, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. The Chaldean spoke to the king in Aramaic, and in fact from this verse to the end of chapter 7, so all of chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is all in Aramaic, the language of the people. And that's probably partly because the next few chapters God wants in a language that everybody can understand. It's not just in Hebrew, which the Hebrews might understand. This is actually written in Aramaic, so that it can go out to everybody alive at that time who has access to, the written words. Verse 4, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll give you the interpretation. Nothing to it. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap, almost certainly with your families still in them. So, I mean, Nebuchadnezzar's not a nice guy. He might be God's servant, but, he's the king in those days when the king's law was, utterly final. No questions about, challenging it, unless you wanted to lose your head. However, verse 6, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time. You're trying to buy time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there's only one decree for you. For you've agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling, of course, is not with us fleshly people. For this reason, the king was angry. Doesn't matter if it's illogical or irrational, I'm the king. I asked you to tell me the dream. If you can't tell me the dream, what's the point of being there? What's the point of drawing breath? You can't answer these things. You're supposed to be the great masters of insight, wisdom, education, teachers, religious people. You have access to your gods, you keep telling me. If you can't tell me the dream, a simple thing like tell me the dream, then what's the point of having you? You're going to be killed. I'm going to destroy all your homes. There'll be ash heaps, dung heaps. For this reason, verse 12, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. All of them. Those there and anybody else for that matter. So had a bit of a temper, I guess. So the decree went out and they began killing the wise men. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So, Nebuchadnezzar's had a dream that God gave him, because God's dealing with Nebuchadnezzar in a very special way. And thankfully, because this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had means something to us today. So it was an important dream, right? It has applications 2,500 years later. So off he goes. He wants to destroy them all because they can't tell him the dream. You can understand, I think, where the king's coming from. If he said, well, this is my dream, like say Pharaoh did. Well, I dreamt about, sheaves of corn, and I dreamt about, skinny and fat cows. If you tell somebody a dream, they can always, my mum used to do that. She was superstitious, Irish lady of Catholic extraction, but she took up fortune telling for quite a while when I was a young boy. And people would come to her, and she'd read the palms. Oh yeah, your line of such and such is taking you somewhere, and you're going to see a dark man in the future. She did tea leaves, sort of shake the tea round in the cup and read the pattern of the tea leaves on the side. I can see, it looks like a blonde lady coming into your life. That sort of stuff. And fortune telling. And she could interpret dreams.
Evil.
Because you have to tell the dreams first, because obviously otherwise the mater has no idea what's going on. And a bit like this here. You tell the king your dream. Right. No, the king tells you the dream and you say, no problem, king. What this implies is the following. The king's not daft. He knows the dream's special. You tell me what it was, and I'm with you. Let's read verses 14 through 23. Then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent to kill everybody? Then Arioch made known the decision to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. I think that's probably indirectly, probably into the king's courtrooms, but not, I think, eye to eye with the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. He asks God, and while he's asleep, I guess Daniel sees the dream all over again. But not just the dream, Daniel also sees, this is what it means, Daniel. Ooh, wow. Verse 20. So Daniel answers and says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand. So it's great. Daniel's asked God, and God says, yeah, here's the answer, Daniel. So Daniel's now in a position to go racing back to the king and say, hold on, here's the dream, this is what it means. But just before we leave this passage here, you've got verse 21, where Daniel in his prayer of praise to God says, he changes the times and seasons, he removes kings and raises up kings. So, and that's true. I mean, God had raised up Nebuchadnezzar to carry out his judgment across Judah and the nations of that day. But I think we have to understand this, that God removes kings and raises up kings as necessary, occasionally, that his purposes might be fulfilled. All right? So God took down, for example, King Herod at one point. Angels struck him, smote him, and he died of worms and stuff. So God can take down a king, God can raise up a king, but I don't think we should read into that every king ever on the earth was raised up specifically by God. Every king who dies or gets assassinated was brought down by God. It just means that God removes kings and raises up kings as occasionally necessary to ensure his plan and purpose goes forward. Nebuchadnezzar, great example. God wanted to judge Judah. He needs a man like Nebuchadnezzar to do that and to deal with other nations, of course, nearby. Because the catch here is some people read this as God removes kings and raises up kings, and then they say, meaning leaders, probably true, and then they say, so all leaders are raised up by God. For example, why did God permit Joe Biden, I've heard this the last few weeks, to be elected, if he was, as a president of the United States?
I want to know that.
Why did God permit that? Who says God is involved? You can't assume that God raises, people say, well, God raises up kings. He's raised up Joe Biden. Or before that, he raised up Donald Trump.
No, it's not like
Did he raise up Adolf Hitler? Did he raise up Pol Pot? Did he raise up Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Genghis Khan? Right? No, God removes kings and raises up kings specifically here and there to make sure his purpose carries on. Beyond that, God permits. Of course God permits. God permits all manner of stuff on the earth. God permits you to go and murder your neighbour. Right? God doesn't want you to murder your neighbour, and God will judge you if you murder your neighbour, but you're permitted to. Pretty stupid if you do, of course. God permits the American people to possibly elect, Joe Biden. God permits the British people to elect Boris Johnson. God permits because he's given permission, authority to mankind to just carry on his stuff. Simple as that. God permits a lot of things. Doesn't mean he endorses them, that he wants them, that he approves them, that he's interested in them. He just allows mankind, and like some people say, basically, in every nation, you get the government you deserve.
Don't keep telling me that.
My wife doesn't like me saying that because she looks at the British government and thinks, I don't really like that government. But, it's as simple as that. So don't take verse 21, he removes kings and raises up kings, to mean that every single king or world leader or tyrant or despot was handpicked by God. Not the case. Somewhere. And I wouldn't know at the moment whether God has reached down his hand and picked up Joseph Biden to drop him into the president's chair. I doubt it personally, but I can't speak on God's behalf. To say God permits it, therefore it must be God's desire. No. God permits sin, wickedness, rape, pillage, torture. God permits all those things. He's not involved in hardly any of them. Just now and then he steps in because it's strictly necessary. So Daniel 2, we're going to read verses 24 to 28. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon, whoever's left at that stage, of course. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I, Arioch, me, Arioch the mighty, I have found a man of the captives of Judah, who will make known to the king the interpretation. So I should get a reward as well, Nebuchadnezzar. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Can you do that? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. And one translation says the end of days. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, as we'll see, goes all the way to the end of the days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these, right? So he's about to reveal to the king what had been really causing him anxiety. He wants to know what the dream was significant. What was the dream? What does it mean? Why did I have it? If these guys can't tell me, I'm slaughter them all. So he's probably quite anxious to find out what this means. He knows there's something special about it. Verses 29 through 35. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. In future years, we've got your kingdom. Now you're wondering, well, what happens when I die to my kingdom, my people, this geography here? What does the future hold? And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. And of course, I'm sure that Nebuchadnezzar was thinking, that's right. Now, whether he'd forgotten any of this, right, or was just waiting for somebody else to remind him, but he's thinking, yeah, it was a great image, that's right. Tall, imposing, powerful, majestic, awesome, frightening. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. You watched, while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This, of course, is the dream, and it's a very well-known statue. I think we have a graphic which we can pop up for you. Nothing particularly new there. I think we've all seen statues or artists' impressions like that. A tall statue of a man with the four metals there, and a stone comes crashing down, smashes the stone image on their feet. The image topples over, and the wind then blows all the bits and pieces, the fragments, away, right? So quite a well-known statue. Now, when we're looking at the meaning of the statue, you have to be a bit cautious there, because a lot of people look at the statue and trying to interpret what it means, and they say things like, well, as I did, there's nothing new here, I've been here, got the t-shirt and all the stuff. But yeah, in olden days, I would say, well, yeah, of course, the two legs picture, two empires, east and west, right? Because I would say that the iron legs of the Roman Empire, there's two legs, one in the east. So, the western part of the Roman Empire, the other part, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, two legs, 10 toes, of course, 10 kings. You have to be a bit careful when you're looking at things like that, because people jump on the two legs, but rarely talk about what do the two arms represent. Well, you said the two legs mean this. You can't just pick and choose, limbs, can you? What do the two arms represent? What do the 10 fingers represent? You say the 10 toes are 10 kings. What are the 10 fingers in? What are the two nostrils? What about the one nose? The point you have to be careful about is this is the image of a man. A man, unless it's deformed, lost a limb in the war or something. A man typically, average man at least, has two arms and two legs and 10 toes. So why jump to say, well, that must mean, and I said this in the past, I said, well, the arm represents the Roman Empire, and, the one leg is the west, based in Rome, and the other leg is the east, based in Constantinople. How did you get that nonsense? Yeah, because somebody tells you, of course. And you have to watch out for it. It's called...
And you're gullible.
And you're gullible. Oh, no, everybody else mentioned it, so I just joined the club. It's an example of what they call confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is when you and I, everybody else, has beliefs, opinions that we believe to be correct. What we tend to do then is we see evidence that supports our view, so we grab it. Oh, this proves I'm right. And all the things that disprove you, and
You
cast
ignore.
doubt. You sort of, I mean, honestly, you don't even see them. It's not that you sort of see them and reject them. You just don't even notice them because your mind just reaches out for things that confirm your belief, your bias. And we had examples of that all over the place, but I remember a conversation, one guy, after services one day, sort of years back, and he was talking about earthquakes, right? And he said, oh, earthquakes, lots of earthquakes this year, which I think there had been, one in Greece, one in Turkey, I think one in Italy and somewhere else. He says, all these earthquakes, that's proof we're in the end time, because Jesus mentioned earthquakes in diverse places. So there you go, earthquakes, it's the end of the days. Well, that's actually confirmation bias, because there have been earthquakes forever. There's earthquakes in the Old Testament, right? There's earthquakes across Europe and Africa and America and Alaska for centuries. There's nothing unusual about earthquakes, but the sort of scenario is people, I believe it's the end time, I believe it's Matthew 24 time, so when I see earthquakes, I'll just grab earthquakes and say that's biblical. You have to be careful there. Okay, let's move on to Daniel 2, verses 36 to 45. So we now have the dream. But what does a dream mean? It means quite a lot for you and me. This is a dream, verse 36. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. God raised up Nebuchadnezzar, for sure. That's his servant. And he is the head of gold. He's the top of this statue, right? Verse 39, but after you shall arise another kingdom, doesn't say king so much, another kingdom inferior to yours. That's probably good news for Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, I think I'm going to be the best of the bunch, the gold. And then after a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. All the earth, not meaning, of course, China and North America and India. It means all the land, the region of the prophecies. The Middle East, in other words, Babylon, Iraq, Persia, Turkey, Asia Minor, all that sort of stuff. Verse 40, and the one that really matters, of course, most. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, pictured by iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Now we'll come back to that because that's key to understanding the interpretation. Verse 41, whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. In the days of these kings, the miry, clay, iron, toe kings, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So, see, the dream goes all the way down to the return of Jesus Christ, which is, of course, yet future. So this is not like ancient history. It starts ancient history, back in the days of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, but it's still running, right? Because we haven't yet got to the kings at the end of the feet. Because verse 44, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It's an eternal kingdom. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces, the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain. Its interpretation is sure. All right? So that tells us all we need to know. Right? That is that chapter there, or in fact, of those just there are 10 verses there, verse 36 through 45. That's one of the key passages in the entire Bible. Literally. Daniel 2, the statue, which we're all quite familiar with, the statue. There's no real problems with that. It describes it to us, gold, silver, and all the rest of it. The question really is, obviously, what does it picture? And there's not too much debate over the gold, because we're told there the gold head is Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, his kingdom. And after that, we've got the silver kingdom, which most people accept is Persia, right? And then we've got the bronze sort of kingdom, the loins and so on. And that's understood to be, the Greek Empire. The one we'll come back to in just a moment, of course, is the iron legs. What exactly is that? Then at the bottom, you have the feet, which the stone crashes, pounds, and obliterates, which is, of course, the kingdom of God. So the question is, what do the two iron legs represent? Rome, one leg for the east. No. The answer is that traditionally, people say it's the Roman Empire, right? That goes back a long time. The earliest it can be found is the writings of the Bishop of Rome, around about 200 AD. Bishop, well, I don't know whether it's Hippolytus or Hippolytus. You choose Hippo, Hippo, that part's easy enough, Lytus. It's either Hippolytus or Hippolytus. But he's long dead, so he won't be too offended if we get his name wrong. But he said, yeah, there's no question about it. The iron legs are Rome, which of course he lived in Rome in the days of the Roman Empire being still strong and powerful, and he couldn't say anything other than that, right? Now, to Hippolytus or Hippolytus, and maybe to you and me and to classical writers down through the centuries, it sort of makes sense, because we live in the West. We live, like many of us, in Europe. Rome in Italy, or perhaps you live in Austria or Germany or the UK. Maybe you live across in the Badlands of the USA and Canada. We live in the West, and we tend to look at things from a sort of Western, centric view. It makes sense to us that, after Greece came the Roman Empire. Makes sense, right? But actually, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't live in the West. His empire isn't in Western Europe or America, right? His empire is in the East, right? His kingdom's in the East. And he's really concerned about what's going to happen over here in the East when I'm dead and gone. We'll get to that in a moment. But whilst we're here, look at verse 40. It says this fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, and it says a couple of times in verse 40, it breaks in pieces and crushes all the others, right? It breaks in pieces. Now, I won't go through it for time, but between verses 40 and 45, the phrase breaks in pieces, breaks in pieces, breaks in pieces, breaks in pieces occurs 4 times. A couple of times it's God's kingdom that breaks in pieces all the others. But here it tells us in verse 40 that the fourth kingdom breaks in pieces all the others, right? Breaks in pieces and shatters everything. Like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Now that's super important, because this is the Bible identifying for us how we can spot the fourth kingdom. It's the one that breaks in pieces all the others. Now this Aramaic, the language underlying this, breaks in pieces is a Aramaic word, dekak, D-E-Q-A-Q, right? D-E-Q-A-Q, dekak, which means, according to the dictionaries, it means to shatter. Well, it means to break in pieces, but that's the translation that we're using. To shatter, to pulverize, to beat into powder. Can you see what that means? To shatter, to fragment, to beat into powder, to pulverize. We've got, I think, a couple of graphics we can show you of pulverized. So there's the first one there, if you're looking at it, is just a picture, I think, of some pottery, strangely enough, which has been bashed and hammered and is broken in bits and pieces. You can do nothing with it, right? It's been pulverized. I think the next one, it's not me, I'm not pulverized just yet, but there's a picture there of, I guess it's the wreckage and the ruins after an explosion or tornado or an earthquake or something. The buildings are all broken down, fragmented. They're good for nothing, right? That's what the word decac, or break in pieces, implies. Something broken down, destroyed, unusable, pulverized, right? And the fourth kingdom, the iron legs, will do that to all the previous. Now, if the Roman Empire satisfies, Bible prophecy, then Rome must have pulverized, destroyed, fragmented, beaten to powder all the previous, because that's what it says. That's what God's kingdom is going to do. It's going to break in pieces, shatter, crush, pulverize all those from before it. Well, here's the issue with the Roman Empire idea. Rome fails the Bible test because Rome never conquered Babylon. It's got to pulverize it, fragment it, destroy it. Never conquered it. Never. Rome never conquered Persia. It's the second empire. So the gold it didn't conquer, the silver it didn't conquer. Rome never conquered, tried hard enough, 4 centuries. Rome never conquered Persia. And Rome never pulverized Greece. Now, of course, they defeated some of the armies here and there, and certainly the Roman Empire's armies defeated their Greek army empires, the Greek empires, their armies, right? But the Roman Empire never pulverized Greece because they actually quite admired it. The Romans maintained the Greek language. In fact, the Greek language was still the normal language in the days of Jesus, hundreds of years later. In fact, the New Testament was written in Greek hundreds of years after Rome came to power because the Romans were quite happy with the Greek language. Rome kept the culture of Greece. Rome kept the religion of Greece. The gods and goddesses, fabulous. Rome kept the architecture. They borrowed it. They copied lots of Greek architecture in Rome and Italian cities. The philosophy of the Greeks, the Platos, the Socrates, right? They kept all of that. So Rome never pulverized, fragmented or smashed Greek or Greece. They just borrowed it. They love some of that, right? So it just never is the case that the Roman Empire destroyed or pulverized Babylon, Persia, or even Greece. I think we've got a graphic we can sort of show you here. This is shows you the Roman Empire is in the red outline, and the red outline shows you that the Roman Empire is west. You're looking at certainly parts of Asia Minor, Turkey, but through Greece, through Austria, Germany, France, Spain, up into the UK, the very, very northern coastline of Africa. The Roman Empire didn't attack much in the east. In the east there, you got the blues and the greens. The Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Greek Empire, they went all the way across to India, down into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, up into Russia. So what you've got is that it's hardly true to say that Rome pulverized and destroyed and fragmented the gold, the silver, and the bronze because they weren't even there. They were a different part of the world. The Roman Empire is west. The empires of Nebuchadnezzar, the gold, silver, and bronze, were east, right? And they just don't fit. So despite the popularity of this idea that, the 2 legs of iron of this special statue in this key chapter, that's the Roman Empire, very popular. And usually you end up with the 10 toes might be 10 nations in Europe, Austria for sure. Okay, you Austrians, you're involved. And Italy for sure, and France definitely, Germany absolutely, right? It's the Huns, the Nazis on the way again, driving down the streets of Milton Keynes and their tanks and all that type of stuff. And probably somehow these 10 nations in Europe are linked with the Vatican, Pope Francesca, right? Despite the popularity, and it is popular, you find it all over the web and so on,
In the churches of God.
And the churches of God, yeah, pretty much most of them. But when you look at the scripture, the iron
Especially
legs have to break in pieces and pulverize everything that comes before them. They never did it, right? Never conquered Babylon, the gold empire, never conquered Persia, the silver empire, never pulverized, right? The Greek empire, the bronze. They actually admired it and brought most of it into the Roman empire, right? So it just does not fit. It doesn't fit scripture. There's only one empire in history, literally. In all of history, there's only one empire that actually did pulverize Babylon, did pulverize Persia, did pulverize the entire Greek empire across to India. Only one empire, and that's Islam. The Islamic empire is the only one that did it. Starting around about 600 AD, out of Arabia comes the Muslim armies, the fighters with their religion, and hardly any time at all. They stretched across the entire Middle East and they defeated Persia in hardly any time. They invaded and took over the area of Babylon. They went right up to Indian border, into southern Russia, almost everywhere. And they crushed everything. Crushed the people, the language, the alphabet, the culture, the religion, all of it crushed, destroyed, replaced by Islam. And in 1453, they even managed to defeat and take over Constantinople. Nowadays we call it Istanbul, which was the then capital of the remaining Roman Empire. They destroyed that as well. And in the 1400 years since those days, they've killed, they believe, somewhere in the region of 270 million people. So Islam, the religion of peace, as it's often known today, has got something like 250 million deaths trailing behind it.
So far.
And I think we've got one more graphic we can show you before we close today. And this, you can see that the red outline there, that's the Roman Empire up to the far west of the area that matters. You've got Babylon in the blue, and the red orangey bit to the right is Medo-Persia, going up as far as India and so on. And then the green, which is most of North Africa. And the green goes through Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. And the green goes all the way through Persia, all the way through Babylon, picks up the entire Greek Empire, and even goes further north way into modern day, Russia and Kazakhstan and so on. That's the Islamic Empire at its peak. So the one empire that fits Daniel 2:40 is the Islamic Empire. Simple as that. And if you look around the world today, we'll finish in just a moment, if you look around the world today and you're looking for areas of concern where war, military action, nuclear weaponry, massive destruction can take place, you probably won't be looking into Europe thinking what the Germans up to these days. Oh, I see they've increased their budget for military from 0.5% to 0.75%. Well, that's intriguing. That's a clear sign that they are the beast power. You look at Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Syria, right? You look at this region, the Persian Gulf, that's where the threats are. That's where terrorist organizations come from. The Middle East, the area of modern day Islam. Well, we didn't get very far really there, but it's probably a decent place to stop. Verse 45 in Daniel chapter 2, just reminding us all that the statue is key. The interpretation of the statue is key, but as far as I can make out, the one empire that really fits the two iron legs, not the two yellow rubber legs, is in fact Islam, right? Not, as so popularly taught, Rome and the Roman Empire. But it doesn't fit scripturally, despite its huge popularity. And with that, we'll close today's Bible study.